esteemed colleague and friend, Ambassador Lewis. I have known Ambassador Lewis for many, many years. He embodies the American dream. He inspired all of us to do well, but to do good. He's guided by the phrase of President John F. Kennedy, who said, "To whom much is given, much is expected." Ambassador Lewis was born in Kansas into a family of Democrats. In fact, he was named for Franklin Delano. Ambassador Lewis is the child of Raymond Lewis, a porter for the Santa Fe Railroad. Ambassador Lewis attended and graduated from Summer High School, a segregated high school in Kansas City, Kansas in 1956. He graduated from the University of Kansas in 1960, where he was a classmate of Wilt Chamberlain. Working full-time at the Marion Clinic and the hospital while attending law school, Ambassador Lewis graduated from the Washburn University School of Law in Topeka, Kansas. After law school, Ambassador Lewis went to work as an attorney in the United States Department of Justice. Later, he worked in the Office of Compliance and in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. From 1966 to 1969, Ambassador Lewis became Associate Director and a Country Director for the Peace Corps in both Nigeria and Uganda. Later, he became Legislative Assistant to Senator Edward Brooke from Massachusetts and Delegate Walter Fortnoy. In 1973, he joined the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company as the Manager of Public Affairs. In 1998, he served as the President of the Greater Washington Board of Trade, and in 1990, he became the CEO of the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company. 3 years later, Ambassador Lewis became President and Chief Executive of National Public Radio, also known as NPR. After leaving NPR in 1998, President Clinton named Ambassador Lewis as the United States Ambassador to South Africa, a post he served with distinction and honor from 1999 to 2001. After starting a consultancy in New Mexico in 2006, Ambassador Lewis was named the founding director of the New Mexico State University's International Relations Institute. Ambassador Lewis has had many honors bestowed on him. The Washingtonian named him the Washingtonian of the Year in 1978. Catholic University awarded him its President's Medal in 1978 as well. In January 2009, he was celebrated as Kansan of the Year because he's from Kansas. He's also the author of the inspiring book, It All Begins with the Self. Having risen to the CEO level of many companies, having been a product of segregated schools in Kansas, having been the United States Ambassador to South Africa during the Clinton administration, Ambassador Lewis is uniquely qualified to talk us tonight about a very important topic in America, race and race relations in America, and lessons learned from South Africa. Please welcome Ambassador Lewis.
Good evening. Good evening. I try once again. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Islam, my friend Frank, for that gracious introduction. I really am proud to be here. That introduction, my father would have been very proud and my mother would have believed every word of it. Thank you so much. It's exciting to be back at Montgomery College. I was here before at the request of Professor Symposia Smith, who just recently became Dr. Symposia Smith. Congratulations. So it's pleased to be back, and there are a number of dignitaries here that I want to recognize, certainly. Margaret Latimer, who is the Provost for Montgomery College, thank you for being here. Sanjay Ray, who's the VP for Academic Affairs, thank you for being here, sir. Joan Nank, who is leading this activity, and had lunch with her yesterday, and she's coordinating activities for the Athenaeum Symposia. And thanks to you, Frank, for your gracious contribution, along with your wife, for the Athenaeum Symposium. We're all pleased to be here. For the School of Education with Deborah Posey, and to Dean Derek Camden, great to see you all again. I'm here to talk about a very, very important topic, but before I do, I want to introduce my family. Because family is very, very important. We're going to talk about a lot of things tonight. My book, It All Begins With Self, is about family and about relationships. But my family is extremely important. And my life partner and my coach, and the one who's the hardest on me, my partner of 56 years, Gail Lewis. Gail? We are the proud parents of 4 adult sons and 11 grandchildren, and we are extremely blessed. We have one son who's here tonight, second son, Jeffrey Sr. Jeff is here, and his wife Lisa, who is a professor at Montgomery College. So Jeff and Lisa, please stand. And I'm so pleased to have 2 grandsons here, Jeff and Lisa's sons, the oldest grandson of the 11, Jeffrey Jr., and his friend, Alex Doris. Jeff, Alex, welcome. And certainly a man after my own heart, because I used to be a dancer in my youth. He's a professional tap dancer, number 3 grandson, Justin Lewis, and his fiancée, Abigail Matthews. Before I get into this very important topic, I must digress just a bit. Because, you know, it's always tough to give a speech when you've got family here and very, very close people. But I know there are students here, there are faculty, there are administrators, and I have a lot to share tonight. But I can't start without telling you about my first arrival to Washington, D.C. When I was a young attorney with the Department of Justice in 1963. I was to begin on my birthday, November 12th, so I came in town about the 9th or 10th or so of November in 1963. My wife and 2 kids at that time were not with me, so I was getting ready to get into our apartment and so forth. The person who I had met through the mail, through a priest in Kansas, who had a good friend in Nebraska, who was now living in Washington, and he and his wife opened their arms to us, and they met me at the airport when I first landed in Washington, and I'd never been here before. So he's here tonight. Curtis, not his brother's Curtis. This is Earl Hunnigan. Earl, stand. And his son Chris is here. Chris, welcome. But I had to give you that little aside because that just sort of talks about my coming to Washington. We're here to talk about a very, very important topic. The topic is about race and race relations in America and our learning from South Africa. And this is a complicated topic and a very, very serious topic. And, you know, race, what is race? Because race, in my judgment, is in the eye of the beholder. Because when we think about race, we're all of mixed heritage. What is race? America is a land of immigrants. So we're going to be talking about our behavior, our reactions to race. We're going to be talking about our response to race and to racism, our response and behavior to stereotypical thinking, our response to biases that we all have. To you students who are in the audience, we're going to talk about history tonight, and many of you may not have a sense of America in the 30s and 40s, 50s, and before, when it was very clearly a segregated country. Many of you have no sense of that, thank goodness. Many of you won't be haunted or burdened by that, but yet it is still among us. So we're going to talk about it tonight, and to begin, we have to understand history. History is extremely important to lay the foundation for our discussion of race. When we talk about our founding fathers and we talk about our Constitution, we have to talk about slavery because it was in the fabric of the founding of this country. We have to talk about the divisions that went about as our founding fathers were putting together this great country. There were divisions based on race. Africans were brought here against their will to become slaves in America. They were not treated as people, but treated as property, to be bought, sold, and traded. As I was doing my research for this speech, and I saw the Constitutional Convention of 1797, they were talking about how we're going to appropriate Congress, apportion Congress, how we're going to tax, how is our House and Senate going to be divided. And so they said, we have slaves, should they be counted as people? When we treat them as property. May I have my bottle of water there, please? Thank you very much. Should they be treated as property? We'd like to have them counted in the population because we have more slaves in the South. That would give greater representation to the southern states. So we like to count them as people, but yet we treat them as property. So they came up with a 3/5 compromise. So you would count the slave 3/5. So that would give the southern states more people in the legislature. They also said we treat it as taxes as well, so they pay a bit more in taxes. But again, this balance, should we treat them as people or count them as property? Let's take the American Indian. And we know our history, Columbus wasn't sure where he was going. He thought he was in India. So he named the natives Indians. But they're better aptly put, Native Americans. When I first came to Washington to work for the Department of Justice, I had a good friend in the Indian Claims Division of Justice. And I began to wonder what that meant. But in our society, when our founding fathers and discovered this great land, there were Native Americans here. And later, we took their land. We passed a law called the Indian Claims Act, so the Native Americans could sue the federal government to get their own land back. So you have to ask yourself, and I did as a young lawyer, is this fair? This is our founding fathers. This is our America. There were economic divisions in this country. They started very beginnings of our country, where land became wealth. So as a capitalistic system, you acquired land, you became wealthy. Obviously, people who did not have means, and obviously slaves or indentured servants didn't own land. So therefore, they didn't participate into the economics of early America. Divisions based on race, divisions based on economics, divisions based on color. Somehow color became a part. And it infused African American culture as well. That the blacker you were in the field, and the lighter you were in the house. Something about skin color was a part and fabric of our society. There were divisions based on religion. There were divisions where compounds of Catholics or Jews or Protestants or Muslims separated just because of religion throughout our society. So this is the founding of America. And when I think about what it does to the psyche, what it does to those who are oppressed, how they think, how they react, and what does it do to those who are oppressing, it has an impact. So with this backdrop, I was born in southern Kansas on November 12, 1938. My dad and mom moved to Kansas City because that's where my father could find a job. And he became a porter on the Santa Fe Railroad for 37 years. He was proud of his job. I could see him now putting on his uniform, shoes shine, tie straight, and he believed in hard work. He brought the paycheck home. As an only child, I didn't want for much. My family believed in education. My mother was a high school graduate. My dad was 11th grade. He worked for 37 years. They gave me everything they could. They stressed arts. They stressed literature. They stressed dealing with an environment and a segregated system. I remember the lunch counters on Minnesota Avenue where blacks sat on a separate section. I remember water fountains that said for whites only and for blacks. I remember going to the segregated theaters in Kansas City, Kansas. The Regal Theater and the Princess Theater were theaters for blacks. We couldn't go up on the avenue downtown to the Electric or to the Avenue theaters. I remember visiting my cousins in southern Kansas. There was also a segregated community, and their movie theater, they had a special section in the balcony for the blacks. And I would go with my cousin, and that's where we would sit. That was segregated America. I went to the only black high school in the state of Kansas, Sumner High School. There were teachers there who couldn't find jobs elsewhere because of their race. So they were teaching at Sumner. We had the best teachers that you could find. They cared for us. They were highly, highly educated. They had their master's degrees teaching at Sumner High School. We had graduates to this day, very prominent graduates from this all-black school. So I went to a black church, black neighborhood, all black schools. Kansas was interesting because high schools in the state were integrated, except mine. Sumner was the only black high school in the state of Kansas. The elementary schools were segregated. You remember Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, one of 5 Supreme Court cases. Linda Brown was trying to get into an elementary school in Topeka, and the case went up to the Supreme Court, and the court said, what is separate is inherently unequal. So integration of schools began with the Topeka case in 1954. So this is the backdrop of my growing up. And I will relate 2 stories to you that I think symbolizes what happens to the psyche. My high school principal named me, along with my good friend Dan Matthews, to go to Kansas Boys State when I was a junior in high school. And if you know anything about Boys State or Girls State, it's an American Legion project of government in action, where you're selected by your high school or community group to set up a government. You set up city governments, you set up county governments, you set state governments, you run for office. These were 500 boys from all over the state of Kansas. And my colleague and I were coming from Sumner. I was a little reluctant. I'd never integrated and gone to school with whites. I was wondering and had this inner fear, can I measure or will I measure up? But when I got there, I hit the ground running. I became drum major of the band at Boys State. I ran for mayor of my small city and became mayor. I ran for Supreme Court Justice and was one of the 7 Supreme Court Justices at Kansas Boys State. That was in 1955. I came back in 56 as a counselor and in 1957 as a counselor. Boys State had a tremendous impact on me because that's when I got a sense of self. That's when I got a sense of self-confidence. And that comes out when you read my book. It all begins with self. The second story is interesting, I think, because several of my friends at University of Kansas got jobs as waiters on the Great Northern Railroad. So I convinced my mom, after pushing pretty hard, to let me go join my buddies to become a waiter on the Great Northern Railroad. One of the best jobs of my life. We were running from St. Paul, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington. I said, if anything happened to me, I could always wait tables. I knew and developed that skill, and to do it on a train is even more precarious. But when I had never been west, got to Seattle, went to one of the older waiters, and I said to him privately, just because we had a half a day in Seattle before we had to come back and work our way back to Minnesota. And I said to him, because we had this free time, I said, where can we eat? He said, what are you talking about? I said, where can we eat? I'm 18 years old, and I was asking him what restaurants were open for black people, because I didn't want to step outside in Seattle and be hurt. So I wanted to know where we could eat. So what segregation does to the psyche is my only point of bringing that story. So this leads to the topic of our environment, our families, our communities, because I don't think people know about race when they're born. It becomes kind of a learned thing. And so that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. Talking about what happens in our families, what happens in our communities, in our environment. You hear people talking about implicit bias now. I think some of the candidates are talking about it. Some of our dealings with the police that we're going to talk about in a second. They talk about implicit bias, and somehow, as you have grown up from the very beginning, we all have them. There are certain kind of biases that we may have, and they react kind of unconsciously. There's something about color that white is right and black is not. Something about these stereotypes of people that become learned behavior. Let's talk a minute about what's happened in the climate of police killings of armed, unarmed blacks in the United States. Whether it's Baltimore, whether it's Ferguson, Minnesota, Charlotte, police killed at least 102 unarmed black people in 2015, nearly twice each week. Nearly 1 in 3 black people killed by police in 2015 were unarmed. This is tragic. And I say to you, how do we explain this? And my perspective is, we have not squarely faced our racial issues of the past or present. We haven't really faced the impact of slavery. we haven't really faced our racial inequities of the past. This has to be done. Transition for a moment. South Africa made efforts to deal with that issue and those issues. South Africa, interestingly, if you know South African history, had a similar segregated society, controlled by the Nationalist Party, which minority white party, over a majority black nation. And they had similar kinds of segregated rules as we had in America. They had separate fountains, separate public accommodations. They had even more atrocious kinds of things like pass books that you couldn't move around unless your book was stamped to move from one place to the next. Segregated facilities, segregated housing. Those were things that South Africa were facing as well. But they began to move beyond that, obviously. And they began, and you must give credit to President de Klerk, who was the state president under that government, who began to have negotiations with Nelson Mandela. And they began to say, we need to move beyond this system. And so they started working with Nelson Mandela while he was in prison. He was in prison for some 27 years. And they began to talk about a post-apartheid. But also they began, after the first free elections in 1994, they began to set up what they call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And this was an effort to deal with their past. This was an effort to bring truth out. They had 3 different committees. They had a committee on human rights violations. They had a committee on reparations and rehabilitation. And they had a committee on amnesty. And they had public hearings where you could come and talk about those atrocities. And people would admit what they did do during that period. And they would talk about the victims and how they reacted. And they began to set up some mechanisms for reparations and for amnesty. Now, there's been criticism as to whether it worked. There were 5,392 amnesty applications that were turned down, and only 849 of the 7,000 were accepted. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been criticized as being ineffective, but in most part, it was effective. The big thing it did, in my judgment, was to let people know that those things did happen. They tried to get at the truth of the past. Maybe America might find some lessons in reconciliation. And the other piece was forgiveness, which I think also was extremely important. If you fast forward, my wife and I were honored to be representing America in South Africa. I was appointed in 1999 as United States Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa. They had just gone through their first democratically free elections with Nelson Mandela elected as president. Thabo Mbeki was his vice president. So when I came in 1999, Thabo Mbeki had become president, and Nelson Mandela had stepped down. I had the great opportunity to present my credentials to President Thabo Mbeki, and had the great opportunity to pay a call to President Mandela. It was a wonderful opportunity to represent our country. The embassy was one of the more important embassies in Africa. We had consulates in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, and in Durban. We had a very large embassy in Pretoria, strong bilateral relations with this great country. So there was obviously, we fast forward with much progress that has been made in America. And we can talk more about South Africa in the questions and answers. But one of the final lessons and sections I want to talk about are the possible solutions to the issues that I've just been discussing with you. The issue of race and race relations, and how we should move forward to advance those solutions in America. Let's look at it as a nation, and what should our nation be doing to advance these relationships. We need to enforce the laws that we have on the books. There has been progress, and in my lifetime and in your lifetime, we've seen tremendous progress through the legal system. I always wanted to become a lawyer to work in civil rights because I felt the rule of law was a way to change things. So I came to Washington to work in the Department of Justice. I went into the Internal Security Division. I didn't get into the Civil Rights Division. But I then moved on to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and began to work on employment discrimination cases. But I've always believed that the rule of law would make a big difference. And I remember when I was in a branch office of the Department of Justice, and our office was on near Capitol Hill, and I had the great honor of going over to the House of Representatives as they were debating the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and to see Representative Adam Clayton Powell of New York, the black congressman, arguing for that civil rights bill. And I was sitting up in the gallery. And that bill was passed, and just to give you a sense of how things happen, in that bill was Title VII, which was employment discrimination. Title VII didn't go into existence until a year later in 1965. Why? Because of the Dirksen Amendment. Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois said, we've got to give the country a year. We've been waiting over 200 years. He said we've got to give them another year to get ready for employment discrimination issues. So Title VII was delayed a year. This is our government in action in the 60s. It took us until 1968 to get the Voting Rights Act, 1965, to get the Voting Rights Act established. And we have to keep working at it because there have been laws to weaken our voting rights for all. So we have to remain very vigilant. So as a nation, I could sum it up that it means leadership. Leadership really makes the difference. The leadership of President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama, our President and the First Lady, who are caring, supportive of all Americans in our country, very proud of all those almost 8 years as President of the United States. When we look at Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison, and he walked out of prison and said, we're not going to treat whites as they treated us, because we're all one South Africa. That's leadership. When we look at Martin Luther King Jr., when he talks about, I hope my kids will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Leadership, absolutely key. Mahatma Gandhi, who spent time in South Africa, said that you deal with social issues with passive resistance, with nonviolence. That was taken up by Dr. King, and to some large measure by Nelson Mandela as well. That's called leadership. And leadership has been extremely important to make change happen for the better in this country and around the world. The next are businesses. I happened to spend some 21 years, as you heard, with C&P Telephone Company, which merged with 9X and became Bell Atlantic, and Bell Atlantic became Verizon. So I spent 21 years and worked my way up from a public affairs manager to president of the company. Again, showing the progress that we've made with hard work and determination, you can rise in the corporate world. But we need to make businesses take leadership role as it relates to race and race relations. Just the other day, I was reading about Goldman Sachs, the investment company that's decided to have dialogues on race. There was an African-American woman partner said, we need to be talking about it. And somebody says, everything's all right at Goldman Sachs. She said, no, we need to be talking about it. And as they sat around the table, these were partners of Goldman Sachs. She reiterated the story that when she first walked into a meeting at Goldman Sachs, someone asked her to serve the coffee. This is present day. So businesses are starting to talk about and facing the fact that we need to talk about this issue. I worked on the board of Colgate-Palmolive for 23 years, just stepped down on the board. I chaired the nominating and governance committee of Colgate-Palmolive. Had the great opportunity from that committee to bring on diverse candidates to the board of Colgate-Palmolive. And I can tell you two things. One, that when I left, we had three women on our board and 2 African Americans on the board of 11. A very diverse board. The second is a company, Fortune 500 company, that has zero tolerance on race discrimination or gender discrimination or discrimination on disability or LGBT. Zero tolerance. You won't last long at Colgate-Palmolive if this is found. So here's a business who's standing up and saying, we're going to face this issue. When I talk about solutions, I think there are 3 things that need to happen as you look at race and race relations. The first is dialogue. There must be dialogue. You can't sweep it under the rug. Yes, we have to deal with it, and we need to talk about it. The second is listening. That is key. We can talk, but you need to listen when people talk. And respect others who are talking, not waiting to get in, but to listen. And the third is understanding. We're not going to make any change or better things unless we understand each other. That there are differences of people and cultures and religions and environments, and we need to understand it. We have our difficulties around the world because we don't understand people around the world. We think that everything we do in America is great and right. I have news for you, that's not true. That we can learn from other people, and we have to understand others in order to make things work. So I go from nations to businesses, and I come now to communities. And I come to educational institutions like Montgomery College. You have a fierce responsibility here. We're not going to make progress or make this nation better until we have the best educational opportunities for everyone. It's got to happen. It's here you learn. It's here you grow. It's here you develop understanding about other peoples and races and cultures and religions. The problems that we have is based because people are ignorant. That's what it is. They are ignorant. And they don't have respect for one another, for people that are different, the people that have different ideas, the people that look different. We don't have respect. Now that can be taught. It can be taught in families, it can be taught in communities, and it certainly can be taught in the classroom. So you have a great responsibility as an institution on race relations and race matters. And finally, we come down to individuals. That's what my book is about. It all begins with self. With the help of my wife, who's written 2 books about our experiences in Africa, with the help of my 3rd son, Brian, who's written a book about his life, they helped me put together this book. And I had never written before, and I wanted to talk about my life experiences, but we decided to make it into a how-to book. So it's a how to connect with people, how to discover your passions, how to succeed in life, using my experiences as models. But I'm saying to you tonight that it comes down to the individual, and you and your families, but you as an individual. That you've got to take ownership here. When I think about my life, and when I think about how far I have come, and the world that's still ahead, yes, there was discrimination in Kansas. Yes, there was racism in Kansas and in this country. Yes, I had issues as I emerged into the corporate world. But what I did, you can do. You can rise above it. You cannot let racism be used as an excuse. Yes, we know it's there, but you rise above it or confront it. You work hard and you persevere. You make the system work for you. Yes, you too can succeed. You treat people as you want to be treated. Those are the values that I got at home, those are the values I got at church, and those are the values that I've always kept. That you treat people as you'd like to be treated. And in families, you teach respect for all humans. You resist labels. You resist stereotypical thinking. And above all, you speak out. You confront racism when you see it. You speak out. So I close tonight by saying to you, I believe we can be a better nation. I know we can be a better nation. It takes all of us, to borrow a phrase from a good friend of Frank Islam and mine, it takes a village. So I'm saying to you, let's do this together. Thank you very much. Opening up for questions and answers. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Chanamoye. I'm biracial. My dad is fully Nigerian, immigrated here from Nigeria, and has his PhD in education. My mom, from Pennsylvania, very much Caucasian. Love her faces, but she's not Nigerian. I've dealt with a lot of racism growing up, partially because I was born in Pennsylvania in a small community, Indiana. So the issue then, at that point growing up, I was the only person of color until I was about 10 and we moved. Nonetheless, my question actually deals with multicultural education. And a lot of schools will claim that they're for diversity, and it's really just a face. And I feel like not enough people spend the time to talk about or have these conversations because they are not actually culturally aware to have them. And it comes from understanding that not everyone can make these assumptions and can understand. So when they go to teach about it, it doesn't really educate. It actually makes a bad name for diversity. And I wanted to know what you would do about those situations when in fact it's not the people that are trying to push cultural awareness, but actually the ones teaching it may have lack of that.
Well, I appreciate your question. I understand the dilemma that you raised. I think I tried to get at that by saying you first have to acknowledge it and you have to put it out there to talk about. And I think, unfortunately, because we've been confronted with our police community relations and those unfortunate incidents, it's just sort of heightened this awareness, but it has at the same time brought it out that we need to be facing it and talking about it. The question about multiculturalism and people really understanding diversity, there's a lack of it on all sides. People don't understand it. Some people haven't experienced it, so they don't understand it. It didn't happen to them. They didn't see it. They didn't feel it. But those of us that have felt it need to talk about it and get them to at least understand it. I'll give you one example of what my son and I, Jeff Sr., who's here tonight, we have been asked by a major company to develop at least to talk to them about helping them develop a diversity program for their company. And my experience has been, and this is to answer your question, that we're making this proposal about not just diversity or a program. We're calling it cultural transformation, where diversity and inclusion will be its foundation. In other words, we're talking about transforming the culture of the business. We're not talking about a program that we set out here and say, okay, there's number 1 and 2, we've done it, we've checked it off. We're talking about changing the culture of the company. So that goes from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top, that you deal with these issues of race, of gender, of multiculturalism, of LGBT, and you deal with it through human resources and throughout your company. So it becomes a part of what you do. Now, why is that important? For a business, it's important because your business should reflect the customers and the clients that you serve. It makes good business sense. That your customers are multicultural. They are different races and different genders. So if you're going to approach them, you need to have that same reflection. So anyway, hope that answers your question. It's not just a program. You've really got to put it in part of the fabric of your system. Yes, sir.
Rockwood. So recently in class, we were talking about affirmative action in the U.S. as well as in Brazil, which is another, multi-ethnic country. So my question is, in your personal and professional opinion, do you think affirmative action is beneficial or detrimental? And if you believe it is beneficial, do you think there are any improvements that could be made? And this is in both school and the workplace.
What was the last part of that question?
So if you do believe that affirmative action in the school and workplace is beneficial, do you think any improvements can be made to it?
Good question. I'll give you two answers to it. One is that, why affirmative action? I use the example of 2 people ready to run a race. And what's happened is that some folks do not have enough background and training to run the race fairly. So affirmative action can be designed to bring people up to the starting gates together, and you run the race fairly. Now, I believe in affirmative action. The downsides have been criticisms that you're counting heads and it's quotas, and it shouldn't be. It should all be on merit. Now, I believe in merit. And my oldest son, who's not here, went to the Merchant Marine Academy, and he wanted no parts of affirmative action. He always wanted to be viewed as his abilities to win or to lose or to excel or not. He did not want to deal with affirmative action, and I respected that. But the point is that not all of us have the ability to run that race fairly, and some of us, because of whatever circumstances, whether it was race, disadvantage, minority communities, or otherwise, we need to be given some training, skills in order to run the race. And so that's why I believe in affirmative action and think it's important. The other piece is diversity and inclusion is a broader step in that direction, and I think it has some improvements to what we knew as affirmative action, because we're not just talking about counting heads with race and gender. We're talking now about diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. And I think when you put all those together, and inclusion is a part of the system, I think you've got something that makes good sense for not only a company, but for the country as well. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Ambassador Lewis.
Hi.
My name is Stephine. I just wanted to thank you for coming to speak to us. It was really insightful. You mentioned something that struck a chord with me regarding the conversation or the dialogue that was started by President de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. Do you think, with the current racial tensions right now in the U.S., do you think that we have any voices or any leaders that you think could meet and start a dialogue like that one?
Oh, I definitely do, and you know, I'm not here, unlike my good friend Frank, who's out there in the political hustings at the moment. I'm not going to name people, but I do believe there are leaders, and that can happen in this country. There are definitely leaders of respect and good reputation on all sides, whether they're black, white, Hispanic, or otherwise, or Asian. I think there are leaders and there are groups. And one of the things I didn't mention in my remarks, and I looked at my notes when I talked about the word civil society, these are groups of organizations. That's also a part of this dynamic of making the change. Yes, leadership's important, and there are people that will rise to the occasion. We had just a comment a minute ago about the tensions in the elections, and the elections are coming up 7 days to go. What's going to happen post-election? I'm optimistic about America. I believe that America will move forward. And obviously with some leaders over others, it may take more time or less time. But I do believe that we will come together and move forward. Because leadership is key. And I think those of us who believe in America, we believe in the strengths of this institution in this country. And those of us will work hard. So yes, I think they're leaders. On the de Klerk Mandela, you know, there were some people who, they both became, received Nobel Prizes for their efforts. And there were some folks who were very critical of President de Klerk getting that prize as well. And I must tell you that it was, you know, I don't sanction what the apartheid regime did by any stretch, but on his receiving that award, he took the courage to have those talks with Nelson Mandela. And if you read Long Walk to Freedom, which is the President Mandela's book, he highlights it and how they brought him into the discussions. They gave him a separate room, took him out of jail, gave him a separate place. They had comfortable surroundings, and they began to talk. And they began to, and that was President de Klerk. It wouldn't have happened if he didn't take that initiative. And he talked to a leader who was respected. And so they spent time, and if you read the book, they were planning all of this together as to when he was going to walk out of prison and this whole transition will take place. And so to show you the strength of Mandela, when you read the book, President de Klerk and others were saying, okay, Nelson Mandela, now's the time. And he said, no, I'm not ready yet. Can you imagine after 27 years, he said, I'm not ready yet? Because he had some things he wanted to tie up. He had some connections he wanted to make. He had some contacts he had to put together. So he said, no, I need a couple more days. But the two of them made that happen. The strength of that leadership, and obviously the strength of Mandela's leadership, because it could have been bloodbath. It could have been more atrocities. There had been some before. It could have been more. But there were much less because of his leadership. And I think that's true. It can happen in America, and will happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Ambassador Lewis. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your vast international experience. I was just looking at what's happening around the world, and especially what can we learn or unlearn implicit biases that we may have from what is happening around the world, as we can see in the news, in particular, what is happening in Israel against the Palestinians. What are the common things that were happening in South Africa and what is happening now in Israel? And how can things be changed so that the Palestinian kids are not being shot at with pellets and becoming blind and the various things that we read in the news?
Very important question, very difficult question. My wife and I talk about these issues quite a bit, just the two of us. We have good friends on both sides of that issue of the Middle East. And the answer is the Middle Easterners have to solve this. It has to be done by Israel and it has to be done by Palestine. We can be supportive, obviously, we can help bring parties together, but it has to be solved by them. And that's a tall order. And again, the leadership question is key and will loom very large. There's one principle that I didn't mention, that I'll mention now, that President Mandela had and he used. I had the privilege of hearing it directly from his lips and the times that I met him. I went to pay a call on him and he was involved with the Burundi crisis, and it was a crisis in Burundi. The country was having difficulties, and he was called in to be a mediator for the issues in Burundi, and he was discussing it with me, and he said in so many words, it has to be inclusive. He said his principle of diplomacy and his principle of nation building is inclusiveness. And so there were 16 political parties in Burundi. And he said, we've got to have all 16 political parties at the table. And so the answer on Middle East is inclusiveness. I mean, you've got to bring those people together and they've got to respect each other. And that's a tall order given the situation today. But that isn't to say it can't be done. But it has to be done by them. Respect for one another. But it's centuries and centuries old. And it's going to take probably more time. Now, the U.S. has been a good friend, and the U.S. has been a good friend of Israel and continues to be. And I think there's been a greater understanding of the Palestinian side. And there's been a movement. For years, we didn't talk about two-state solution. I mean, that was an anathema. You didn't even mention it. It was always Israel. But today, the common language is two-state solution. So we have made some progress. Now, whether that's going to happen and when it's going to happen, it's going to take some time. But the answer is on a lot of things I said tonight, respect for one another, leadership, principles of inclusion, all of that has to happen. It happens in diplomacy. It's nothing unusual about it, very simple in many ways. I was reflected on when I was doing my research for the speech about Rodney King when he was brutally beaten by the police in California way back when, and he made this simple plea that just stuck with me for years. Can we all just get along? I mean, it was a very simple plea. He was beaten by the police and he says, can't we all just get along? And when you think about it, that's what it's about.
And this will be our last question.
Yes.
Good evening. My name is Sebastian, and my question to you is, do you believe that as an American society and as a global society, if we steered away from the idea of race, that we would turn to a more non-judgmental state as a world?
I love the question because, again, my wife and I have discussed this question over and over and over. And the answer is to your question, that's the ideal, and I hope in my lifetime that would happen, that we could get past it. I spent tonight talking about it because it needs to be talked about. I spent the night trying to get you to understand that all of the romantic idealism that we placed on this country called America had some very real beginnings that need to be put on the table. But I think the ideal is to get past it. The ideal is to look as people, and that's what we should be working toward. And I'll just give this personal story. that I was raised, as you heard, in Kansas City, Kansas, in a segregated society. My wife was raised only 40 miles away in an integrated situation. Her father and mother were educators. They lived on a campus outside Topeka. She went to Catholic schools, integrated schools. Her life was completely different than the life I had. And when we first met and talked, I couldn't believe she didn't look in racial terms. She didn't think, and still doesn't think in racial terms. I did. That's because of my upbringing. She didn't because of her upbringing and environment. And we still talk about it. And we both try to give our kids and grandkids that sense of the ideal, that sense of people as people and getting beyond race. It's your question. The last question is a good one. That's definitely what we should be about. Thank you very much.